You know, tonight is a really special moment for me. Many of you know, I became a father during the pandemic, and at the same time held space for incredible health crisis within my family. So this idea of holding a blessing and a crisis simultaneously requires sitting, requires a groundedness, requires friendship, requires a reminder that we are indeed made for these times. Let me tell you just a little bit about the Garrison Fellowship very briefly, and then we'll transition to our beautiful conversation and dialogue this evening. The Garrison Institute Fellowship has 11 wonderful human beings who have embarked on a 2-year journey to explore 4 particular pillars. One is a contemplative-based wisdom, generative action, collective healing, and the science of interconnection. And each fellow has a question, a query in relation to their vocation and field. And you should just see these folks. They're just brilliant, brilliant. And the Fellowship Forum series is a way for us to hold space in public and bring in just a different tenor and tempo in terms of dialogue in relation to the broader Garrison Institute programming. And it's just with a great honor that I host this evening, and that I really not just moderate this conversation, but in a sense, begin the process of cultivating what Kate Johnson calls a radical friendship. So I want to unapologetically plug in both of their texts. First, Kate's radical friendship, and secondly, Kaira Jewel's. We were made for these times, and I was just joking with them, and I said that they look great as copybook tables, coffee table books. So they look great in my coffee table, and they look even better when they're in my hands and I'm reading them individually, but also reading across the text. I want to begin by asking both of them a question to check in with them, to see how their spirit is. And as I read across both of your texts, the Dharma indirectly and directly is transmitted and speaks through. So first, how are you both doing, and in what ways is your work an extension of the legacy of Thich Nhat Hanh? Just to start lightly.
Thank you so much, Angel and Monique, for holding us so beautifully, lovingly, and for this question. Just a week after Ty's passing. I would just say that I'm feeling more connected to people, which I think can often be the case after someone passes. Like, just people have been reaching out to me from many different times of my life, people I haven't been in touch with in a while. Kate sent me a lovely message. um, so I had a chance to go to Blue Cliff Monastery with a dear friend who's here tonight for Jules for 2 days and be with the Sangha, really celebrating his life, and to really feel how, there is this field of people and many hearts in many places that are carrying on his teachings, his energy, his vision for what's possible in this world. So I think I was happy to be able to pause somewhat, to really take this in and to really process it. And I still feel like I need more pausing, like I've come back into the busyness of life, and I feel like this needs more space to really be felt and understood and integrated. And so I'm looking for how to create more space for this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for hosting us, Angel. And yeah, it's an honor to be here. And what a question. And I never had the good fortune to sit with Ty while he was alive. Most of what I know of him is through people who are close to him, like Kaira Jewel, like Marisela Gomez, like Dr. Larry Ward, who are all like, spiritual friends and teachers for me. And through his books, which I always recommend, people will ask, like, what book do you recommend to complete beginners or someone who's wanting to learn about Buddhism? And I always recommend The Heart of the Buddhist Teachings, which is so, incredible and comprehensive. And then, there's these other writings that, of course, like, beautiful poetry that is so elegant and direct in its tone. And yeah, I've learned from the legacy of just how he held the Sangha. I have a young kid too now. And so in my tradition of insight meditation, it's not so kid friendly, it's really geared towards a seclusion that can be very powerful in kind of gathering and concentrating the mind. And I was always inspired by the, seeing images of Ty with children sitting around him, giving Dharma talks, and the hearing from families who felt so welcome, at Blue Cliff and other places with their kids. So part of what I've been experiencing this last week or so has been, it's something in between regret and just awareness of the preciousness of life. And it really has made me, there were a couple of times where I could have gone to sit with Ty. Once, actually, it was right before I was on a 3-month retreat with Kaira Jewel, which is where we met and became friends. We were in silence for that whole 3 months, but I knew we were friends. And after we could talk again, she confirmed that we were indeed buddies on that retreat. But he was going to teach a group of educators just right before that in Canada. And I thought about going, and I decided to go to this 3-month retreat instead. And there was a time when I was younger where I actually looked and saw that Plum Village had this young monastic program where you could go for 3 years and ordain. I thought about it, and then I thought, no, I had other reasons for not going. But all this to say, I don't know if I'm living out the legacy of his teachings, but what I know is that his passing has made me has reminded me how important it is not to wait when we feel called to connect with to someone or just be around them. And I think his words about his statement that the next Buddha will be the Sangha is something that I try to remember all the time, and it gives me like confidence that the path of relationship is a good and true spiritual path.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. I'm just presencing Thich Nhat Hanh's breadth of wisdom beyond the Buddhist tradition. In particular, if you want to get an inkling of just his ability to synthesize and draw on multiple streams of wisdom, read Living Buddha, Living Christ. My God. My God. What a text. I have the intention of at some point this evening, giving us a little bit of an embodied practice. In full disclosure, I meant to do it earlier in the opening, but what's coming up for me is that we'll do it when it feels right, and we'll shake things off at a particular point this evening. So sit tight for now, but we'll move soon. As we kind of pivot towards maybe another question, I want to bring up another ancestor who's joined the realm of the stars, Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks and her work. And just so I'll bring her up just to honor her. And I want to begin with you, Kate, in terms of your book around radical friendship. I know that Bell wrote a lot about love and radical love, but tell me, I know that is when we were talking before this engagement, you wrote the book almost as a contract between you and the universe. Could you tell us more about why you wrote this?
Yeah, well, I'll say I didn't know it was a contract when I wrote it, but I wrote the book for a couple of reasons, but I think what's on top now is that I was really, I was working in mostly in spiritual communities who were trying to do more around social justice, and in particular racial justice and environmental justice work, and had an analysis around how society transforms, and that it really happens on 3 levels. It's a personal, individual transformation of the body, heart, and body, heart, and mind, and the kind of letting go of clinging, as we would call it in the Dharma. And it has to do with bringing principles of liberation into relationships, and then also kind of liberation of systems. And in the places where I was working, we had a really strong personal practice of meditation primarily, and then a really strong kind of social justice analysis. And the middle piece around how we relate to each other, we were struggling. And there was a lot of drama. There was a lot of betrayal, both within the activist communities I was working with and in the more spiritual communities. And there was also this real desire I started thinking about it right as the movement for Black Lives was starting to gain momentum. And the community that I was working with is, I would say, mixed race community, but predominantly white, and really trying to kind of find our role within this movement, and looking especially at this role of an ally, and did that feel right? Is that the way to be a part of the revolution, as an ally? And wanting something that was actually more intimate and less transactional than something like allyship, right? And so I was just really excited to learn about and dive more deeply into the Buddhist teachings on spiritual friendship, because I thought, wow, we have a model here within the Buddhist teachings for what it means to show up for liberation, our own liberation and each other's liberation, and how we might strengthen relationships so that we can stay together long enough to affect the kind of change that we need, rather than kind of gaining momentum and then crumbling because of internal, relational suffering, which is a part of life, right? But there's this possibility that we could, meet those moments, and with the help and support of wisdom teachings, actually stay together, was a hope and a dream of mine. So that's a big part of why I wrote it. And like, it became a contract because, as I was saying earlier, when you write a book on friendship, people expect you to be a little bit an expert in it, which I'm not. But it comes up so often now that I'm in a moment of relating with someone, and I would like to back away from intimacy because it feels difficult or messy or inconvenient. And then I remember that all of the studying that I did and all the practicing I did, and I think, oh no, this is actually a moment to step into relationship and step into practice. So I'm glad I did it. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's definitely become a beautiful life practice.
Yeah. If I were to make a connection between radical friendship, your text, and Kaira Jewel, your book, we were made for these times. As I read your book, Kaira Jewel, it almost feels as though the thrust of the book comes out of a radical friendship you have with the collective. And the book itself is a supportive endeavor to help us and to support us in these times where it just feels like there's just a lot unfolding before us. So tell me, like, what moved you to write this text, and the subtitle being 10 lessons for moving through change, loss, disruption. And, in Kate's book, the subtitle is seven ways to love yourself and find your people in an unjust world. So I'm just weaving here, bear with me. But yeah, what's coming up for you there?
Thank you. And it's just so lovely to hear your journey to this book, Kate. And this book came from a course that I made for Insight Timer, the app. And I thought, well, what do I know about? Because I could only share something that I know about. And at that point, I was about 4 or 5 years out of robes. So I was a monastic, a nun for 15 years. And then probably one of the most challenging things I've ever done was to leave that life and start all over with really nothing solid to land on. So it was really a leap of faith of just like, I need to do this, but I have no idea what's going to happen, and if even it will turn out at all well. And so one of these retreats that was really a key part of me, just having space to be in chaos, to have all of the questions, all of the insecurities, all of the, I have no idea what's going to happen next, to sit in that, to stew in that. So, I did 4 retreats in silence at the Insight Meditation Society. That's where Kate and I met. And Kate and I were on the same row. There was one other person next to me, and then it was Kate. So we were always sitting together for 3 months, like all day long in silence. And I felt like I knew you, Kate, in this deep way, though we'd never spoken. I mean, I heard you ask questions in the hall. You must have heard me, but very little, verbal connection. But I felt such a deep spiritual connection that was just from sitting next to you, just seeing how committed you were to showing up on the cushion. And it was such a support to have the three of us. It's just like, oh, this is my posse. I have a place to land day after day. But that was a key, those experiences were key parts of just, I mean, I don't know if I would have lost my mind, but there was so much anxiety, so much fear, like what is going to become of me? I'm being called out of this thing that I know that has held me, that I love, into something I have no idea what it is going to be. And those spaces of just month after month of stillness were places of safety where I could just begin to get my bearings of what life might be outside of the monastery, outside of robes. So that's what I ended up writing, making this course about. It was an audio course of like what helped me go through that really difficult time of so much loss, of so much change, of doubt, of questioning myself. And then my partner actually was listening to the course with me, and he said, you should make this into a book because you already have all of the text written. And I thought, oh, I didn't think of that. And I did share the text with Parallax Press, and they were happy to publish it. So it changed some after making the course. I think it deepened and grew, and people made good comments of how it could change a little bit. But I really wrote it to share what really worked for me and is working for me in times times are still difficult. I mean, they're getting more difficult for all of us with all of the uncertainties, globally. And so I was trying to kind of share like a fractal, like this is how it happened in my personal life, but I think it's not that different on a collective level in terms of what are the basic truths of what actually works in our inner landscape and our outer landscape to keep us anchored when things are really kind of tearing at us and pulling us apart. So, the course came out right before the pandemic was declared. And I had kind of seen it as more of just sharing my personal journey. And then it was just kind of amazing to me, like the timing, and then to hear how many people like in lockdown in their apartments alone in March and April and May, they were writing to me because there was this interactive course saying, this is so helpful. This is such good medicine for me at a time when I'm suffering so much. And I was like, wow, I had no idea it would meet people in such a kind of appropriate way in such a difficult time. So I'm so grateful that it did happen like that.
Too, and I'd love to at some point to turn to some of those practices and recommendations that allow us to get through these times. And before we jump to that, I'd love to, I know that you both have read each other's texts. So I think that would be a beautiful weaving in this moment to hear, Kate, what you found, that excerpt you found, and to sit with that. And then to hear you, Kaira Jewel, what you found in Kate's text. There's a conversation happening across these texts that is embodied in your friendship, but might even go beyond that in terms of why these two texts emerge at this time. There's something larger here that I'm trying to touch thematically, but maybe even synergistically, maybe even divine, possibly. Wink. But Kate, talk to me.
Okay, well, there were so many parts of this book that I love. I actually ended up choosing something that feels kind of appropriate for what you were speaking about, Kaira Jewel, before. It's towards the end of the book. It's the chapter on we were made for these times. And oh, it's okay, I could read your own words to you. When I was in the process of deciding to leave monastic life, I was terrified. I had no idea what would come next. And I was giving up security, love, and belonging for a totally unknown future with absolutely no guarantees. Yet I knew I had to take the leap and leave the safety of my life to see what would await me. It was the first time in my life I was making a decision that was not supported by most of the people I loved and respected. But as I listened to my own intuition, my inner voice, I learned that I could trust it. As soon as I made that first small tentative step into the unknown, it was as if the earth rose up to meet my foot and supported me. One invitation to teach led to another, and I was able to slowly begin to support myself and connect with communities that welcomed me in all my awkwardness of moving out of one identity, but not yet fully into something else. Each step gave me more faith and trust that I could do this. Life was calling me to keep going, and it continued to support me at every turn, even if I couldn't have seen quite how just 1 or 2 steps back. I just kept going, and sure enough, there was a way for me. By walking, one makes the road, as poet Antonio Machado writes. For nearly 20 years, I had been singing a song our community sang often, "Here is the Pure Land." It includes this line: "The Sangha body is everywhere. My true home is right here." The Sangha body means the community of those practicing on the path of awareness and compassion. Only when I left the monastery and was received and nourished by spiritual community after spiritual community in many parts of the world did I realize the deeper meaning of this line in the song. As a nun, I believed the monastic community was the only place I could truly practice deeply. And part of my terror of leaving was the fear that I would lose my practice without the 24-hour-a-day support of a residential monastic community. But as I traveled and led retreats and events on my own for the first time, I experienced more and more clearly lay communities that were extremely dedicated and put incredible energy into nourishing their local groups with mindfulness. On my previous teaching trips, I had always traveled with another nun. Now that I was alone with the communities I was visiting, we were more vulnerable with each other. The barriers between monastics and lay people began to come down. And I experienced how held and supported I was by the Sangha body that was truly everywhere, and how my true home is right here, not only in the monastery around other monastics, but also in the middle of daily life in a busy city surrounded by all kinds of people. My true home is anywhere there is practice, anywhere I am showing up fully present to connect and be with others. I began to touch and understand that I already had everything I needed. Whew, it gives me chills a little bit. And I mean, again, there's so many passages I love in that book, but the things that moved me to share this one, there were a few. One, I was, what it reminded me of, and I'm not deeply trained in this tradition, but I have had some teachings in a Vajrayana Buddhist lineage where they talk about the teachings kind of happening on 3 levels. It's like outer, inner, and secret level. And I really felt like this transmission of this like internalization of the Sangha, that it's both everywhere and also right here, as this kind of, next evolution of teachings around spiritual friendship. Like, how is it that, we practice in such a way that we are able to feel that our friends are right here, wherever we are, and thinking about how important that might be in a time like this, where we're still, so many of us physically isolated from the people that we love. So, part of it was, wondering from you, like how you continue to care for this inner Sangha, and the relationship kind of between the outer and inner Sangha. I know that for me, partnership shifted many of my friendship relationships, and we're in a culture where like a primary romantic partner is so much more, there's so much more societal value placed on that than on our friendships and even community relationships. So those are the kind of curiosities that I have coming out of that piece, a beautiful piece of writing.
Oh, wow, such profound questions. I don't know if I can address them. My answers might not be as deep as the question. And I love that outer, inner, and secret level, and how you offered that back to me. Angel, also, you're offering us back stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. So, the part of what I was feeling as I was hearing you read is, I think there was also time was a factor in me understanding this, that I think I needed to spend all of those years in the Sangha and taking refuge in the external holding, so that I could begin to feel it more and more in myself. Like if I had left the community a year or two after becoming a nun, I don't think those things would have happened for me in the same way. So part of it was like, being, the outer Sangha was reflecting to me over and over again what was in me, but I needed also space and conditions to develop. And so, I feel now that I will never be outside of that web, and there's a sister Gina, was a very dear mentor to me. She's still a senior nun in our community. She would talk about it as feeling ourselves part of a web, a net out of which we cannot fall. And I think, the outer Sangha helped me to connect with that, so that now, wherever I am, I want to be connecting with Sangha, even if I don't live in a residential community. Right now, like our 4-year Spirit Rock teacher training, Kate, that was a holding that was really important for me. I knew when I left the monastic Sangha, I was like, I need to find friends. I need to be with other people who care about what I care about, who also reflect back to me aspects of my identity that I really need reflected back. And our cohort really did that. So I think I'm always looking to find and create and be in Sangha, physically or online or however that manifests. It's interesting too, like having a dog has really changed my life. And it was really lonely. Even, I moved back to the US, and I began to live with my partner, and that was a whole new world of really being in this, committed relationship. But then as the pandemic wore on and we just weren't being around anybody else physically, it started to get heavier and heavier, this sense of isolation. And then when we got a dog, a puppy, she opened these worlds of connection to my neighbors. And I started talking to people and talking to them, and they're meeting their dogs and having my dog play with. I mean, so many connections formed, even if they weren't like spiritual community. But I consider that an aspect of Sangha, because it's like it's part of mental health for me to just be around people and have whatever, just shooting the breeze kind of, you know, small talk. But like every week I get to do that with people as my, you know, as our dogs play together. So just to say, like, Sangha is something that I think I cannot live without. And even if it looks very different from how it looked when I was a nun, that inner and outer Sangha are always like magnetizing each other, pulling each other, you know, to each other. And so caring for one is caring for the other, really. And it's how I stay healthy. It's, you know, it's how I create a healthier world, is by building these connections. And then the partnership question, I think, is so deep. And I have really kind of been puzzled by even as I mentioned that it was quite lonely, and how wonderful it was to get to meet people through my puppy. I have also kind of felt that there's being in a relationship with someone who you know, I love so much and who loves me. It's so fulfilling on so many levels that I'm surprised that I'm not more trying to have connections with friends. I still maintain connections with friends through phone calls, but I'm a very extroverted and social person, and so I'm kind of like, and I know it's partly the pandemic, but I think there's a part of me that knows that that's something that I need to also keep in balance. And it's at the beginning of our relationship too. Like, we've been together like a year and a half now. So I'm sure that will, you know, there'll be more energy I'll put into friendships, I think, you know, over time. But I think there's so many things that have just made this, you know, the pandemic and moving from one, you know, country to another, a lot of things just sort of made it so that this really has been my primary place of connection. So I'm going to turn around, and if that's okay, Angel, that I can.
Please.
Okay. Is your emphasis on just, you know, this central teaching of the Buddha, that when Ananda says, oh, friendship is half of the holy life, and the Buddha says, don't say that, it is the whole of the holy life. So friendship is really the core of what we're doing on this path, is being supported and nourished by each other. And there's so much in this book that is just so deep. And I learned so much reading it. And so I wish I could read 10 passages, but I'm just going to read this one. This is from your chapter, Keep Secrets, in this section on listening as a superpower. It's one of the key ways to be there for our friends. So in moments when we feel too overwhelmed, when the suffering seems too deep and we've lost sight of our own and each other's resilience, we can build our capacity to listen by asking for help. A few years back, I was invited by the organization Green Faith to attend a gathering of young faith leaders from around the world just before the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris. Our job was to generate a global multi-faith climate justice campaign. We kicked off our convening at a monastery in Rome with presentations by leaders from regions that were being hit hardest by the climate crisis. I listened to firsthand accounts of unprecedented storms, wildfires, droughts, and rising temperatures around the world, and saw pictures of the effects on the land, animals, and people, predominantly poor people and people of color. When the climate activist Betty Barca showed us images of the eroding coastlines in her homeland of Fiji, a result of sea levels rising, She delivered a message from her elders as well. They told me to ask you to please send earth, send sand, she said through her tears. What we had is slipping away. That was when I lost it. I walked out to the bathroom and sobbed in despair. The climate disaster seemed too far gone. I couldn't see our way out of this mess. I felt so far from the center of decision making, unable to contribute to stopping the crisis in any meaningful way. It had been a long time since I prayed. I grew up Catholic, and I'd made my break from the politics of the church in my early teens. But right there in the bathroom stall of the Catholic monastery in the heart of Rome, I let my heart whisper, I need help. Mm. Mm. When I dried my tears and left the bathroom, I saw Yeb Sanyo sitting on a bench across the courtyard, looking up at the sky. Yeb was one of the organizers of the convening, a climate delegate from the Philippines, who was leading a pilgrimage on foot from Rome to Paris. I sat down next to him and looked out over the yard. How's it going? He asked. Fresh tears started rolling down my cheeks. I should have been a lawyer, I told him, or a researcher or a politician, someone who could do something about this rapidly heating planet. He listened to me and then was silent for a while. You know what I do when I feel powerless? He asked. I ask myself 3 questions. First, what do I love? What do I love so much that it lights up my heart that I would protect it with my life? The second question is, what is my skill set? What do I know how to do and do well? And the third, well, it's not exactly a question. I just think to myself, no action is too small. It is a mini pep talk. And while it may not even be true in the ultimate sense, it gets me moving again when I get stuck. We sat together a while and talked side by side about my answers to those questions. Eventually, Yeb asked if I was ready to go back into the conference. I was. In the years since, I've used his questions countless times when I feel uncertain about how to respond to the suffering I'm witnessing on large scale. I just love this story, and it's so, both the despair and the meeting the end of your rope, but then also finding your way back to what really is possible. It's so, it speaks so much to the heart of, I think, what all of us are experiencing in this time. So you kind of had me talk about friendship, connecting to my book. Now I'm going to have you talk about moving through difficult times as it shows up in your book. We were made for these times. So, so would you share about how these questions, how, looking at what you love and what is your skill set, and no action is too small. How is that a guide for you? And yeah, how would you speak to us with this story?
It's so great actually to hear you read it back to me. Thank you for that. And I mean, one of the things that just strikes me immediately is that the agreements that were made during that climate summit didn't hold, and that we find ourselves in even hotter water literally than we were back then, And I have to say that I am not, I love this earth, and I didn't even know how much I loved it until I got to be actually going to retreat in these, remote kind of places was the first time I developed this intimate relationship with land. And on that retreat that we met, I would go walk after dinner most nights, and started to learn like each of the there was an owl that would come out at a particular time and sit on a particular branch. And then there was this family of, the funny thing is we were in silence and I had not been in the wilderness. So I'm like, are those otters? Are those beavers? What are the, I don't know what they were still, but they were furry, brown, watery things that would, there was a family of them though, that would come out and swim at the same time each day relative to the sun. And so I would kind of come around and I didn't know what time it was because I wasn't wearing a watch, and it didn't matter because we were just going back to meditate at some point. So I started to name, as I was walking around the pond, name the times: pink o'clock and orange o'clock and blue o'clock, and then night. And this is new for me because I grew up in Chicago. I grew up in the city. I tell people, I've told this before, but I was a child of the 80s. So when what I knew about the environmental movement was save the rainforests. And I had this book about rainforests that I really loved. And my mom says that when I was, must have been second or third grade, I was reading this book. I'd read it over and over. I really loved it. At one point I said, Mom, I hope one day I can go to the environment. And she was like, oh no, like this is an environment too, right? It's just it's a city, but there's nature here too. But so all this to say, like, part of it was this childlike thing. Part of it was that back then, the environmental justice movement was, as I know it, like very white and very focused on saving environments that were outside of the United States, and hadn't at that point really put together the ways in which the climate crisis disproportionately affects poor people and people of color globally. And I didn't feel like it was something I could be a part of, in any real way. And now that the climate crisis is so dire, and now that I have 2 kids that are that I am, I'm invested in the future generally for all people. And then the idea of 7 generations feels very concrete for me in a like genealogical way. Still trying to find my footing in terms of what's my role in this movement. And I feel that we all do have to have a role at this point. So these questions, what do I love? Like learning to admit, how much I love this planet and this land, and that like I can belong to the earth, and that understanding that my sense of separation from the earth is actually like not something to be embarrassed about. It's not my fault, but it's a legacy of colonization and enslavement, and that healing my relationship with the land is a part of decolonizing. There's something like that feels very radical about like saying to the earth, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, I want to protect you, thank you, thank you, thank you for not giving up on us. And then, skills, like that's, I still feel really like, dang it, like I there's not a lot of practical skills that I bring to this, except, so it just, I have a history of, direct action organizing. That's not where I'm at now in my movement life, for a variety of reasons. So skills include both like making the connection and presencing both the love of this planet and the urgency of the action we need to save it. And then part of those skills are like really just like really ordinary skills, like looking at like, how do I spend, where do I place my resources? How do I use and reuse items or not? Like where have I internalized the forces of greed and delusion outside that now like drive my individual behavior? Not that I think that, I know that in a technical standpoint, my individual like recycling is not maybe going to have that we need actually, governments and business to step up and take a dramatically different stance towards how they use resources for any of our individual actions to be registered. Like being ready at an internal level not to resist the kinds of shifts that we'll need to make, and the sacrifices we'll need to make individually in order to make that happen feels right, and feels like prefiguring the world that we want to see rather than lagging behind it, kind of scratching for the last bits of the world that needs to die actually. And then, yeah, I think that's maybe part of where no action too small comes in. I really, and I'm stop talking in a second, but I know many of us are deeply influenced by Adrienne Marie Brown and her work in emergent strategy. And one of the things that I think about often is her work, her articulation of the importance of fractals. And I think the phrase is small is all or something, but it's this, the whole emergent strategy, I understand it is this, that we can that we can affect large complex systems through our relatively small and simple interactions. And I don't fully understand how that happens, but I observe it to be true. So thank you for that question. It's like, difficult to answer, and I'm really still working with it. But I appreciate it being a part of this conversation, because I think it does bring us into this kind of collective friendship space that I think you're leading us into, Angel.
Yeah, I want to say that I can sense how much each of you love this planet. I think the publishing of your text is an example of that. And then I can also sense how much you love each other. And I can also sense how much you love yourselves. So just that individual, interpersonal, and a collective. I just kind of see it really embodied in this conversation. In terms of practice, typically when we think about mindfulness and other contemplative approaches, we tend to visualize folks in cushions, sitting, eyes closed. What I want us to kind of presence is that we've been practicing since we began. We've been engaging in what some may call relational mindfulness, really engaging in a paced dialogue that allows each person just to take up space in whatever way and rhythm they wish, and the response being the same, responding in whatever rhythm we'd want. So I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to bring our bodies into this moment. We've been sitting attentively. I want to bring our bodies, and I want to bring the audience. So just for like a minute, I'm going to pose a question, And I want you to practice in whatever way makes sense to you. You don't have to stand up, but you will have to, in some way, shape, or form, engage this beautiful thing that you are enfleshed in. Just the next minute, let's take a moment to move, whether it's standing up or moving in your chair or, just stretching, just whatever makes sense to you. I'm actually gonna stand up. My back is communicating to me, brother, stand up. Just kind of. And I'm wondering how, as we move, we're actually enabling our entire organism to metabolize every single word that came up in this conversation. The expression "think with your feet," it's not just an expression of clever thinking, but also a way for us to think with our bodies. Think with this entire thing, not just our minds. Adding our hearts, adding our back body. Just taking a few more, just 30 more seconds just to move. If we were to be a little playful as you move, what's a question you have for these beautiful beings? And if you could ask it by just your movement, what would that look like? What would that feel like? And as you close out your short practice, this moment is for you, community. So we'll have just an open moment to hear from you all. And I want to do this thing called question stacking. So we'll hear a few of you, your question, your query, your thoughts, consecutively without stopping. And then we'll check in with Kate and Kaira Jewel to see if there's anything in particular bubbling up. We know that time is limited, and in these kinds of forums, we could do this for a whole weekend. So just want to really make sure that we center the community. So we want to hear as many of you as possible. So you can raise your hand in the raise your hand feature in the participant dashboard.
Thank you for bringing this up, that, the way many of us here, for example, are accessing this is not necessarily that accessible to like people in your community that you're talking about, for financial reasons, for time reasons, for, many reasons. And so, what Thich Nhat Hanh would often say is, if you don't have a Sangha, then start one. And the other thing that Kate spoke to is, this child-friendly practice space. And so if people are struggling to have childcare and, struggling to get to other places, or, what would it mean to go to them? To do something in the schools, for instance, or to do something with parents and children in a kind of festival, kind of celebratory way, with food, with music, with, meditation, where it's a family practice time. And parents and children can practice together. And I've led family practice groups, where we come together, and the parents and children, we all practice meditation together. We learn songs, we learn dances, we do art, and we're talking about the values of mindfulness all the time. And there's a bunch of resources. If any of this, it seems like something possible, I'm happy to share. There's a whole book of sharing Buddhism with families. It's a workbook. It's what you do with parents, what you do with the kids. Sumi, London Kim, and then I have a book that I helped edit called Planting Seeds, Practicing Mindfulness with Children. It has, in the days when we listened to CDs, but it has guided practices for children. maybe you are in a Spanish speaking community, is that right? So there's Spanish speaking resources also. I don't know where the overlap is between children and parents stuff and what's out there in Spanish, but I have Dharma teachers and Buddhist teachers that I know that do work in Spanish. So I'm thinking what would make it easy for them to participate and enjoyable, that where it's a natural thing, you know, where, because mindfulness is not like foreign to our cultures, to our many different BIPOC cultures. You know, like I realized after I learned mindfulness and went back to visit my grandma, Black Baptist woman from the South, every time she would remind me to turn off the light, she was teaching me mindfulness. You know, so just to say, like, all of our communities have this, and it's not necessarily like this big leap that has to happen, you know, like just strengthening the things that are already there in our cultures that bring joy, that bring connection, that support health, that support, you know, healthy communication, you know, like having parents and children sit together and tell each other what they appreciate about each other. That's a practice from Plum Village. We call it watering the flower. You know, that can be a beautiful practice to just say, okay, parents, you come prepared to share what you love about your kids. Kids, you could write a card, you know, that could be an activity for the kids, or you might just share, you know, thank you, mommy or daddy, whatever, for this or that. And it's a very touching, very nourishing thing that the kids keep in their mind for a long time when you do that kind of ceremony for parents and children. So there's lots of resources out there for these things, and I'm happy to try to connect you to them at some point if that would be helpful.
I love what you're saying, Kaira Jewel, just to echo around, like, what are the ways that our communities are already, you know, as individuals and also in communal ways, keeping ourselves and each other healthy, and like, how can we do more of those things consciously? And as a leader, you know, what can you do to make space for those things, even in some small way? And as a larger mindfulness community, what can we do to offer resources towards, you know, someone like you who is gathering people in this way? I want to loop back to your earlier question about unity in the BIPOC community, and just, you know, what your mentor said about how, you know, they always split us apart, and like, how do we stay together? And I think, you know, one of Kaira Jewel and I's teachers, Larry Yang, talks about how white supremacy is fundamentally fragmenting, you know, and that I think what's difficult is sometimes we feel in BIPOC community the pressure of that, but we don't necessarily see the source. You know, what we see is each other. And so I think part of our individual practice can be, when we are in conflict with one another, to just ask ourselves, you know, does this interpersonal suffering we're having right now have a systemic root? You know, is part of the reason why we're in tension with one another because of scarcity that is not our fault? You know, is it because we're all struggling to make ends meet in a system that's not designed for us to survive? You know, like, and it's hard to remember, like, and give each other grace when we're in systems like this. And if we can remember, hey, we're actually we can direct our frustration not at one another, but at the systems that create such tension and such stress. And to generate compassion for ourselves and each other when we feel the sting of that, I think is always a good practice. Not easy to remember, you know. And then another thing that has been helpful that I've been thinking about as I start to think about, you know, being more a part of community here in Philly, where I live now, and cultivating community, that for many of our mindfulness communities, we don't really have a conflict resolution plan in place. Like, so we start thinking about conflict resolution when there's already a conflict, and the manure has hit the fan, so to speak. And we're like, oh, I guess we should have a way to fix this, right? I think whenever possible, it's wonderful to have, you know, early on, some conflict resolution skills from whatever again, they might already be within our community. There might be others that we draw on. I look at often at the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. They have some really great resources for, how to have community accountability and have a process of that. But it's basically like the best way to, I think, avoid the breakdown in community that comes with conflict is to have some conflict resolution skills built up already, so that when we find ourselves in conflict, we know how to handle it, and we feel like this is what we've been training for. We have the skills to be able to meet this moment, and we don't have to run away from one another just because there's been a conflict, because there will inevitably be in any community. And part of, I think, what we decide when we to decide to belong to a community is like, when it eventually happens that there's conflict or tension, can we try to stay, provided that there hasn't been abject, there hasn't been serious harm. I think that there's, this is not talking about that, but this is talking about personality conflicts, attitude problems, like power struggles, you know what I mean? Like, how is it that we can, keep our awareness on what is good enough within this community and worth staying around for? And what are the skills that we need to navigate these, like, normal human experiences that always come up when we have groups of people together, BIPOC or not. So I hope that's helpful. But yeah, so good to see you again. Yeah.
Can I just add one sentence to what you so beautifully shared, Kate? Did you mention Larry Yang? He has this phrase, maybe it's from all of East Bay Meditation Center, but breaking together. I love that, this sense of, we often say breaking apart, but at East Bay Meditation Center, and this sense of we can break and break together, that things can happen, but we're still together in the, in the tension, that actually can be very creative, very fruitful. So thanks so much.
So just thank you too for this, and just deep bow.